The sun hung low and angry over the desolate stretch of the New Mexico territory, a burning copper coin that refused to offer mercy to the cracked earth below. It was late summer in the year 1873, and the heat did not simply exist. It possessed weight and texture. It pressed down on the shoulders of men and horses alike, tasting of alkali dust and dried sage. Rimstone was less a town and more of a scar on the landscape, a bottleneck carved out of the hardpan where the Texas border bled into the lawless scrub of New Mexico. To the north lay the jagged teeth of the mountains where the Comanche still rode free, and to the south lay the endless, baking emptiness that swallowed weak men whole. Everything that moved across this part of the frontier army columns, cattle drives, desperate settlers, and men running from the hangman had to pass through the throat of Rimstone. The town smelled of unwashed bodies, horse manure, and the metallic tang of impending violence. The buildings were slapdash structures of weathered gray timber, their facades bleached bone white by the relentless sun. Water was the only gold that mattered here, and it was running scarce. The creek had retreated to a muddy trickle, and the wells were coughing up sand. But while the water dried up, the whiskey flowed, and with it came the bitterness of men who had gambled their lives on the West and were slowly realizing they held a losing hand. Rose Calder stood inside the stifling back room of the general store, staring at her reflection in a cracked piece of mirror propped against a crate of dry beans. The glass distorted her face, splitting her image in two, which felt entirely appropriate. There was the Rose she had been, the innkeeper's daughter with a quick laugh and a love for reading penny dreadfuls, and the Rose she was today. She was 24 years old, though the sun and the hard wind had etched fine lines at the corners of her eyes that made her look older. Her hair was the color of dried chili peppers, a deep, burnished red that refused to be tamed by pins or combs. Even now, strands of it escaped to cling to her damp neck. Her eyes were gray, the color of a storm cloud that never broke, holding a hardness that had not been there 3 years ago. She looked down at her hands. They were not the soft hands of a lady in a catalog. They were rough, the nails short. On the back of her right hand, a jagged white line cut across the skin, a souvenir from a drunken drover who had thought the innkeeper's daughter came with the room rental. He had learned otherwise when she drove a paring knife through his palm. Rose rubbed the scar with her thumb. It was her reminder. No one was coming to save her. In this world, a woman was either property or a predator, and she had run out of time to be neither. "It is time, Rose!" a voice croaked from the doorway. She turned to see her father, Elias Calder. He looked small, shrunken inside his oversized coat. His eyes were watery and rimmed with red. Shifting away from her gaze, he was not a bad man. Rose knew that. He was simply a weak one. The drought had killed his livestock. The depression had emptied his inn, and the poker tables at the saloon had taken the rest. Now, the only thing of value he had left was his daughter. "Don't look at me like that, girl," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "Judge Mortimer says it is the only way. The debts, they will take everything. At least this way. You get a husband who can provide. You get a roof." "I get sold like a heifer at the stockyards," Rose said. Her voice was steady, lacking the hysteria her father likely expected. She had spent all her tears weeks ago when the gavel first banged down on their property deed. "Do not pretend this is for my benefit. Papa, it is to keep Silas Mortimer from throwing you in a debtor's cell." Elias flinched, but he did not deny it. He wiped his nose with a dirty rag. "There are good men out there, Rose, lonely men, ranchers with land." "And who decides which one I go to?" Rose asked, smoothing the front of her dress. It was her best dress, a faded blue cotton that was too tight in the bodice and frayed at the hem. She had washed it 3 times, but the red dust of Rimstone never truly left. "The highest bidder, that is who?" She walked past her father, her head high. She felt a surge of pity for him that tasted like bile. He was broken. She would not let Rimstone break her. If she was sold to a monster, she would wait for him to sleep, and then she would run. She would walk into the desert until her feet bled, but she would die free. That was the only vow she had left. Outside, the town square was filling up. A raised wooden platform had been erected near the water trough, usually used for hangings or political speeches. Today, it was for the auction. Watching from the shadowed overhang of the livery stable, Silas Mortimer took a slow drag from a thin cigar. He was a man who cultivated an image of civility in a savage land. He wore a black frock coat despite the heat, a pristine white shirt, and a silk cravat. He was the town judge, the banker, and the unofficial king of Rimstone. Silas did not see people when he looked at the crowd gathering in the square. He saw leverage. He saw the desperate miners who owed him for their picks and shovels. He saw the ranchers who had mortgaged their dry acres to his bank. And he saw the women, 6 of them today, as assets to be liquidated. The concept was simple enough to pass as charitable. The bride auction was billed as a civic service. It brought women from the East or destitute local families to the lonely men of the frontier. The men paid a fee to the town to cover the women's debts or travel expenses, and a marriage was performed on the spot. In reality, the fees went straight into Silas Mortimer's pocket, and the women went to whoever had the heaviest sack of gold dust. "Everything is in order, Judge," a man muttered beside him. It was Sheriff Tate, a heavy-set man with sweat stains mapping continents under his armpits. "Colton Briggs is here. He's been eyeing the Calder girl for months. He's got his money ready." Silas smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not reach his cold eyes. "Good. Briggs is a fool, but he is a rich fool. He will pay double the debt to get his hands on that redhead, and once he marries her, I will have influence over the Briggs cattle herds. The railroad needs beef, Sheriff, and I intend to be the one selling it." "The railroad," the sheriff grunted, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "You really think they are coming this far south through Comanche land?" "They will come," Silas said, flicking the ash from his cigar. "Progress is an iron beast that eats everything in its path. And I hold the fork and knife. Once we clear out the savages and the squatters, this land will be worth $10 an acre instead of 10 cents. He checked his pocket watch. It was 4 o'clock. The sun was beginning its long, bloody descent. "Start the show. Sheriff, let us see what the market will bear." At the edge of the town, where the wooden buildings gave way to sagebrush and cactus, a rider sat motionless on a painted pony. He blended into the landscape so perfectly that 3 men walked past him within 20 yards and never turned their heads. Kai Nokoni was young for a man who had seen so much death. He was perhaps 25 years old. He wore the buckskins of his people, stained with earth and grease, but over them, he wore a white man's faded cavalry vest, the brass buttons tarnished dull. His hair was long and black, bound back with a leather thong. On his high, sharp cheekbone sat a thin, pale scar, a memory of a knife fight in a canyon 2 winters ago. He was Comanche, the lords of the plains. But here, in the shadow of the white man's town, he was just another Indian scout, tolerated for his utility and despised for his blood. Kai watched the town with eyes that were dark and flat, revealing nothing. He was not here to trade furs or drink the burning water that made men crazy. He was here on a hunt, though his prey was not an animal. He shifted slightly, the leather of his saddle creaking. Beneath his vest, tucked against his heart, lay a folded piece of paper he could not read but knew by memory. It was a map of the Iron Road. The railroad surveyors had been driving their wooden stakes into the earth near the sacred burial grounds of the Numunu, the people. Kai had pulled them up by night, burning them. But for every stake he burned, 10 more appeared. The elders argued. Some wanted war. Some wanted to retreat deeper into the Llano Estacado. Kai wanted to understand the enemy. He needed to know where the Iron Snake was going to strike. But there was another reason he had ridden into Rimstone today. A debt of honor. 5 years ago, a white man named Tom had found Kai and his younger brother bleeding out in a dry riverbed, ambushed by scalp hunters. Tom had hidden them in his wagon, cleaned their wounds with whiskey, and driven them to safety, risking his own life. Tom was dead now, taken by a fever. But Kai remembered his words during those delirious nights in the wagon. If the world turns upside down, boy, and you ever find yourself near Rimstone, you look out for my kin. My friend Elias keeps an inn there. He has a girl, Rose. You promise me, if the wolves come for them, you are the dog at the door," Kai had promised. A Comanche did not break a word given to a man who had saved his blood. He nudged his horse forward, the animal stepping high and quiet. The town was loud today, shouting, cheering. A strange, frenetic energy that smelled of lust and desperation. He saw the crowd gathering at the square. He saw the women on the platform. Kai felt a tightening in his chest. He hated these towns. They were cages built of wood and greed. But he dismounted, tying his horse to a rail separate from the others. He checked the knife at his belt and the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. He moved into the crowd, a shadow slipping through the gaps between bodies. The auction was underway. The auctioneer was a man with a voice like a grinding stone. "Sold to Mr. Abernathy for $40. A young woman, barely 18, sobbing into her hands, was led down the stairs to a toothless miner who looked as if he hadn't bathed since the war. The crowd whooped and hollered, passing bottles of whiskey back and forth. Rose stood at the back of the line on the platform. She felt the heat radiating off the wood planks through the thin soles of her boots. She kept her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the purple bruise of the mountains met the sky. She refused to look at the men. She refused to let them see fear. "Next up," the auctioneer bellowed, sweating profusely. "We have the widow Miller, a fine cook. Gentleman and strong can plow a field as good as a mule." The laughter was coarse and cruel. Rose felt a wave of nausea but swallowed it down. She was the last. She was the main event. She knew why. She was not the youngest, nor the prettiest in the conventional, soft way men liked, but she was the one with the reputation. The red-haired hellcat, they called her. Men wanted to break her. It was a challenge. She scanned the crowd, finally letting her eyes drop. She saw Colton Briggs in the front row. He was a big man, handsome in a fleshy, arrogant way, wearing a hat that cost more than her father's inn. He was grinning at her, peeling an apple with a long, silver knife. He caught her eye and winked, then sliced a piece of the apple and popped it into his mouth. "He owns me already," she thought, a cold dread settling in her stomach. He has bought the debt. This is just a show. Then, her gaze drifted to the edge of the crowd. There was a man there who did not belong. He stood taller than the townsfolk, isolated by a buffer of empty space that people instinctively left around him. He had copper skin and hair black as a raven's wing. He was looking at her. Rose had seen Comanches before. Usually, they were riding fast, silhouettes on a ridge, or trading briefly at the fort. She had been taught to fear them, to save the last bullet for herself if they ever attacked. But this man was not attacking. He was standing perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes met hers. For a second, the noise of the crowd fell away. Rose expected to see the same hunger she saw in Briggs, or the same calculation she saw in Silas Mortimer. But the Comanche's eyes were different. They were observant, calm, and terrifyingly deep. There was no lust there. There was recognition. It was the look a wolf gives a trapped deer, not necessarily to eat it, but simply acknowledging that the trap exists. "He knows," she thought. "He knows I am trapped." And finally, the auctioneer's voice boomed, shattering the moment. "The prize of the afternoon, Miss Rose Calder." The crowd roared louder this time. Whistles cut through the air. "Now, Miss Rose has spirit. As some of you know," the auctioneer laughed nervously. "But she is a fine housekeeper, literate, and, well, look at her. Gentlemen, start the bidding at $10. $20, a voice shouted immediately. It was not Briggs. It was a dirty cowboy near the back. $30, shouted another. Rose felt her skin crawl as if covered in insects. She stood rigid, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into the old scar. $50. Colton Briggs stepped forward, his voice booming. He looked around the crowd with a smirk. "Let us stop wasting time, boys. $50. The crowd quieted. $50 was a month's wages for a good hand. It was a lot of money for a woman with a sharp tongue and no dowry. "Going once at 50, the auctioneer began. Silas Mortimer watched from the side, a satisfied glint in his eye. The script was playing out perfectly. Rose felt the world tilting. $50. That was her price. That was the value of her life. She looked at Briggs, saw the cruelty in his smile, and thought about the small pistol she had hidden in her boot. Would she have the courage to use it? Kai watched the woman. He saw the tremble in her hands that she tried to hide. He saw the man, Briggs, looking at her like a piece of meat he intended to tenderize. Kai felt the old conflict rising in him. The elders said to let the white men eat each other. Let them rot in their own greed, his grandfather had said. We fight for the land, not for their women. But he remembered the white child. 3 years ago, a raid on a settler cabin that had gone wrong. The screaming. Kai had tried to stop a young warrior from killing the boy, but he had been too slow. The look in that boy's eyes, the absolute, crushing realization that he was alone, had haunted Kai's dreams ever since. He looked at Rose Calder. She had that same look, the look of the last one left alive, and he remembered his promise to Tom. If the wolves come for them, the wolves were here. They were wearing suits and cowboy hats, and they were smiling. Going twice, the auctioneer raised his gavel. Colton Briggs was already reaching for his money pouch, confident, arrogant. Kai let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The path of the warrior was simple. The path of the man who walked between worlds was hard. Today, he would make it harder. He stepped forward, the movement fluid and silent, breaking the circle of the crowd. $100. The voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that cut through the dust and heat. It was a deep, resonant baritone, accented but clear. The auctioneer froze, his gavel hovering in midair. The crowd fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. Heads turned. Colton Briggs spun around, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Silas Mortimer straightened up, his cigar freezing halfway to his mouth. Rose blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down from the platform. The Comanche stood in the open sun, his hand raised calmly. He held a leather pouch in his other hand, heavy with the weight of gold dust and coins he had earned from army scouting and trading furs. $100, Kai repeated, his dark eyes shifting from the auctioneer to Rose, and finally settling on Silas Mortimer with a challenge that was silent but deadly. For the woman and the debt. The wind whistled through the square, kicking up a devil of red dust, swirling between the girl on the block and the warrior who had just declared war on the town's order without drawing a weapon. The exposition was over. The inciting incident had begun. The silence that followed Kai's offer was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and thick with a violence that had not yet found its release. The wind died down as if the land itself were holding its breath. $100 hung in the dusty air, a sum that defied the poverty of the town and the station of the man who had spoken it. The auctioneer, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who usually prided himself on his booming voice, looked as though he had swallowed a scorpion. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked helplessly at Judge Silas Mortimer, seeking instruction on how to handle a breach of natural order so profound it had no precedent in Rimstone. Rose stood frozen on the platform. The wood beneath her boots felt suddenly like the edge of a cliff. She looked at the young Comanche warrior standing alone in the square. The crowd had instinctively pulled back from him, leaving him in a circle of isolation. He did not look like a man making a purchase. He looked like a man delivering a verdict. Colton Briggs was the first to break the paralysis. The rancher's face had turned a shade of purple that matched the veins throbbing in his neck. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty ground, missing Kai's boot by an inch. "You have got to be joking," Briggs growled, his hand drifting dangerously close to the ivory handle of the revolver at his hip. "You cannot sell a white woman to a savage." "Abernathy, it is against God's law, and if it is not against the territory law, it ought to be." Silas Mortimer stepped forward. the heels of his polished boots clicking on the hard-packed earth. He did not look at the angry rancher. His eyes were fixed greedily on the leather pouch in Kai's hand. Silas was a man who worshipped only one deity, and its name was Prophet. He knew the contents of the town charter better than any man alive, mostly because he had written the loopholes himself. There is no law in Rimstone specifying the race of a bidder. "Mr. Briggs," Silas said, his voice smooth as oil sliding over a whetstone. "Only that he must be a free man with the means to pay. He is a Comanche," Briggs shouted, gesturing wildly. "He is likely to scalp her before they clear the town limits." "I am paying a debt," Kai said. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the rancher's bluster. He did not look at Briggs. He kept his eyes on Silas. $100, in gold dust and trade goods, to clear the name of Elias Calder. Rose felt a shiver run down her spine. He knew her father's name. He knew the nature of the transaction. This was not a whim. The crowd began to mutter, a low, ugly sound like a hive of agitated wasps. They looked at Rose with a mixture of pity and salacious curiosity. She could hear their whispers, sharp and cruel. "Serves her right," a woman in a faded bonnet hissed to her neighbor. "Too proud for her own good. That one. Remember how she broke that drover's nose last winter? Maybe a savage is the only one who can tame a filly that wild. I heard she carries a knife in her garter." A man chuckled darkly. "Let us see if she uses it on him, or if she likes the rough sort." Rose lifted her chin, staring out over their heads. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. She locked her knees to keep them from shaking. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing against her chest. She was being discussed like a broodmare with a bad temperament. Her value weighed against her spirit. Silas Mortimer walked down the steps of the platform and approached Kai. He extended a manicured hand. "Let me see the payment." Kai tossed the pouch. It landed in Silas's palm with a heavy, satisfying thud. The judge opened the drawstring, peering inside. He dipped a finger in, tasting the dust, and nodded slowly. He pulled out a folded pelt beaver, thick and lustrous, worth $20 on its own. "It is sufficient," Silas announced, a smirk curling his lips. He turned to Briggs. "Unless, of course, you wish to raise the bid, Mr. Briggs. $110, perhaps." Colton Briggs looked from the judge to the Comanche, his pride warring with his wallet. He wanted Rose Calder. He had wanted to break her spirit ever since she had rejected his advances at the spring dance 2 years ago, but $100 was a fortune, and spending it to outbid an Indian felt like a different kind of defeat. "I am not paying a king's ransom for damaged goods," Briggs sneered, his eyes raking over Rose's form, lingering on the slight tear in her sleeve and the defiant set of her jaw. "Everyone knows she is trouble. Let the redskin have her. She will likely cut his throat in his sleep, and then the army will hang her. 2 birds, 1 stone." Silas shrugged, closing the pouch and sliding it into his coat pocket. "Sold," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "To the man, Mr. No Coney." "Wait," Briggs barked. He stepped into Kai's personal space, his chest puffed out, his hand resting on his gun belt. The air in the square grew electric. The crowd held its breath, hoping for blood. A duel would be better entertainment than an auction. "You think you can just walk in here and take a white woman? You think you are better than us?" Kai looked down at the rancher. He was younger than Briggs, but his stillness made him seem ancient. He did not reach for the knife at his belt. He did not reach for the heavy colt on his hip. He simply looked at Briggs with a flat, unimpressed gaze. "I did not buy her to fight for your ego," Kai said. The insult was precise, cutting deeper than a blade because it was spoken without heat. It dismissed Briggs not as a threat, but as a nuisance. Briggs's face went mottled with rage. He half drew his pistol, the metal gleam catching the sun. "Colton," Sheriff Tate's voice rang out, tired and warning. "Put it away. The auction is legal. I'm not having a shooting over a woman." Briggs hesitated, his knuckles white on the grip of his gun. He looked around the circle of faces, seeing that while they hated the Comanche, they also respected the gold in Silas's pocket. Money was the only true law in Rimstone. With a curse, Briggs slammed the gun back into its holster. "Watch your back, savage." Briggs spat on the ground near Kai's boots. "The desert is a big place. Accidents happen." Kai did not answer. He turned his back on the rancher, a gesture of supreme indifference that enraged Briggs further, and walked toward the platform. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Rose. Up close, she saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the dust in his long black hair. But she also saw something else. The men in Rimstone looked at her and saw a body to be used or a worker to be exploited. Kai looked at her and saw a person. It was a terrifying realization because it meant he expected something from her other than submission. "Come down," he said softly. It was not a command, but it was not a request either. It was a statement of fact. Rose gathered her skirt in her hands. Her legs felt like lead. She descended the stairs, each step taking her further away from the life she knew, however miserable it had been, and closer to an abyss of the unknown. When she reached the ground, the smell of him hit her wood smoke, leather, and sage. It was the smell of the wild country that terrified the town dwellers. "We must sign," Silas interrupted, waving a piece of paper. "The debt transfer and the marriage license. We run a civilized town here. Everything must be legal." Silas motioned to a small table set up near the water trough, where a nervous, balding man in a clerical collar stood sweating. It was Reverend Thomas, who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else on God's green earth. "Make it quick, Reverend," Silas snapped. Rose found herself standing before the table. The paper was thrust in front of her. The ink in the well was drying in the heat. "Sign here, girl," Silas said, tapping the line. "And be grateful. Your father's slate is wiped clean. You are free of your burden." "I am trading one burden for another," Rose whispered. But she took the pen. Her hand shook as she scratched her name. Rose Calder. Kai took the pen from her. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, electric contact of warm skin against cold. Rose flinched, pulling her hand back as if burned. Kai paused, glancing at her, then bent to sign. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant, learned from mission schools or perhaps the man he had mentioned, the one he owed a debt to. He signed, Kai no Koni. "By the power vested in me," the Reverend mumbled, rushing through the words as if fearing God might strike him down for officiating such a union. "I pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss, no cheering, only the dry rasp of the wind and the hostile silence of the town. "She is yours," Silas said, patting his pocket where the gold lay. "Take her and go. I do not want trouble in my town after dark." Kai nodded once. He turned to Rose. "We leave now." Rose looked around the square. She saw her father standing in the shadow of the store, weeping into his hands, too ashamed to look at her. She saw Colton Briggs watching her with a promise of violence in his eyes. She saw the faces of women she had known her whole life, turned away in disgust or judgment. She realized then that she had no home here. She never really had. She had been a piece of furniture in her father's inn, a curiosity for the men, a target for the women. "I need my things," Rose said, her voice sounding brittle to her own ears. "No time," Kai said. He reached out and took her arm. His grip was firm but not painful, unlike the bruising grasp of the drunks she had thrown out of the inn. "I have a horse. We ride." "I am not leaving without my mother's locket," Rose insisted, planting her feet. The stubbornness that the town whispered about flared up. She might be bought, but she would not be erased. Kai looked at her, really looked at her, for the second time. He saw the set of her jaw, the gray eyes that refused to weep. He seemed to calculate the time it would take versus the will of the woman before him. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "Meet me at the livery stable. If you are not there, I will leave." "You paid $100 for me," Rose challenged, a bitter edge to her voice. "You would not leave that much gold behind." A ghost of a smile touched Kai's lips, or perhaps it was just a trick of the light. "Do not test me. Rose Calder." He released her and turned to walk toward his horse. moving with a predator's grace through the crowd that parted for him like water. Rose stood alone for a heartbeat, the paper declaring her a wife fluttering on the table under a stone weight. She felt the eyes of the town on her back, heavy and hateful. She was now the wife of a Comanche. To them, she was worse than dead. She was tainted. She turned and ran toward the inn, not to say goodbye to her father, but to grab the small satchel she had packed days ago. She had known this day was coming. She had packed a knife, a change of socks, her mother's silver locket, and a small, leather-bound book of poetry. As she ran, her mind raced. He had bought her. He had saved her from Briggs. But for what? To be a slave in his village, to be a hostage against the army? Or was it truly just a debt to a dead man? She burst into the back room of the inn. Grabbing her satchel from under the loose floorboard, she stopped only for a second to look at her reflection again. The woman in the mirror looked terrified. "Survive," she whispered to herself. "Just survive." When she emerged from the alleyway behind the livery stable, Kai was waiting. He sat atop a paint horse that looked strong and fast, holding the reins of a second mount, a sturdy mare that looked like she could run all day. He did not help her mount. He watched as she tied her satchel to the saddle and pulled herself up, wincing as her skirt caught. She adjusted her seat, gripping the reins. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I can ride anything with 4 legs," Rose snapped, masking her fear with anger. "Good," Kai said. He looked toward the main street where Colton Briggs and a few of his hands were gathering near the saloon, mounting their own horses. The tension in the air had shifted from commerce to pursuit. "They will follow," Kai said, his voice low. "Not now, but soon. Briggs does not like to lose." "Where are we going?" Rose asked, her heart pounding in her throat. Kai turned his horse toward the open desert, away from the road, toward the jagged scar of the canyon lands to the north. "Away from here," he said, "to the only place they will not follow immediately." "And where is that?" "The Deep Narrows," Kai said. "Apache country." Rose's eyes widened. "That is suicide." "Staying here is suicide," Kai replied. He kicked his horse into a trot, not waiting for her reply. Rose looked back one last time at Rimstone. The sun was setting, casting the town in blood-red light. It looked like hell on earth. She turned her horse and followed the Comanche into the wasteland. As they rode out, leaving the safety of the settlement behind, Rose realized the truth of her situation. She had been sold by a white man, bought by a red man, and was now riding toward a land that wanted to kill them both. The inciting incident was over. The deal was struck in golden ink, but the real payment in blood and survival was just beginning. They were 2 outcasts now, tethered by a piece of paper and $100, riding into the dying light of the frontier. The wind picked up, howling through the sagebrush, whispering warnings that only those born to the wild could understand. Kainokoni did not look back, and after a mile, neither did Rose. The red dust of Rimstone did not settle easily. It hung in the air like a curse, clogging the throat and stinging the eyes. As they moved away from the livery stable, the mare Kai had brought for Rose suddenly reared, spooked by the sharp crack of a whip from a drunken drover nearby. The animal, skittish and barely broken, twisted violently, nearly throwing Rose into the dirt before she could find her stirrups. Kai was there in an instant, his paint horse cutting off the mare's retreat. He saw the panic in the animal's eyes and the instability of the situation. With the crowd closing in and the mood turning ugly, there was no time to calm a frightened beast. "Leave it," Kai commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. He extended a hand. "Get behind me, now!" Rose didn't argue. She saw Colton Briggs pushing through the saloon doors, his face a mask of fury. She abandoned the mare and gripped Kai's forearm, swinging herself up behind him onto the paint horse. The animal shifted under the double weight but held steady, trained for the burden of a hunt. As they trotted out of the main thoroughfare, Rose sat rigid, her hands hovering hesitantly before finally gripping the leather belt at Kai's waist. Her body was stiff, every muscle coiled tight, trying desperately not to press against the back of the man who had just purchased her. The town did not let them leave in peace. "That is right. Run along," a woman shouted from a boardwalk, her voice shrill. She spat onto the ground as the horse passed, the glob of saliva landing in the dust near the horse's hooves. "Taking your trash with you." Rose kept her eyes fixed on the back of Kai's head, refusing to look left or right. She felt the heat of his body through his buckskin vest, a dry, living warmth that terrified her. She was acutely aware of where her thighs pressed against his, of the way his muscles shifted as he guided the horse. A group of miners jeered, making obscene gestures. "Check her teeth. Chief, make sure you got your money's worth." But not everyone was cruel. As they passed the last row of shacks, Rose caught the eye of Mrs. Gable, the washerwoman. The older woman paused over her tub, wiping suds from her red hands. She didn't shout. She just looked at Rose with a profound, sorrowful pity, and then slowly crossed herself. That silent gesture hurt Rose more than the insults. It was a prayer for the dead. Kai ignored them all. He rode with his back straight, his eyes scanning the horizon, treating the townspeople with the same indifference one might show a pack of barking camp dogs. He urged the horse into a canter, and the rhythm forced Rose to wrap her arms tighter around his waist to keep from falling. She could smell him now, not the stale whiskey and sweat of the men in the saloon, but pine resin, wood smoke, and the clean, sharp scent of rain on dry earth. They rode in silence for hours. The sun began to dip, painting the desert in violent shades of violet and bruised orange. The town of Rimstone became a smudge of gray smoke behind them, and then it was gone, swallowed by the vast indifference of the territory. It was not until the moon began to rise, pale and sharp as a bone hook, that Kai finally slowed the horse to a walk. The silence of the desert was immense, broken only by the crunch of hooves on gravel and the distant yip of a coyote. "Why?" Rose asked. The words scraped her throat. She hadn't realized how thirsty she was. Kai did not turn his head. "Why what? Why did you do it? $100. That is a fortune. You could have bought a herd of horses. You could have bought rifles." "I do not need more horses," Kai said simply. "And rifles run out of bullets." "Do not speak in riddles," Rose snapped, her fear momentarily giving way to frustration. "You know my father. You knew his name." Kai guided the horse down a dry wash, looking for a place out of the wind. "I knew a man named Tom," he said, his voice low. "A white man. A freighter. 5 years ago, my brother and I were pinned down in a gully by scalp hunters. We were boys. We were going to die." Rose listened, her cheek resting against his back as the horse picked its way over the stones. "Tom drove his wagon between us and their guns." Kai continued. "He took a bullet in the shoulder meant for me. He hauled us into his wagon and covered us with grain sacks. He drove for 3 days to get us to safety. He never asked for payment. He only asked for a promise." Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Tom," she whispered. "Tom Miller. He was Papa's partner. He died of the fever 2 winters back." "He told me that Elias Calder was a good man with bad luck," Kai said. "He told me he had a daughter. He said, if the world turns black and you are near Rimstone, you watch out for her. You balance the scales." Kai pulled the horse to a halt near a cluster of boulders that offered shelter from the wind. "I have balanced the scales." Rose slid down from the horse, her legs trembling from the long ride. She looked up at him as he dismounted. The moon cast half his face in shadow, making the scar on his cheekbone look like a canyon on a map. "So I am just a debt paid?" she asked, her voice shaking. "A marker on a ledger." Kai looked at her across the saddle. "You are alive," he said. "Be content with that for tonight." They made camp in silence. There was little wood, so Kai built a small fire from dried sage and twisted roots. It burned quickly and hot, casting dancing shadows against the rock wall. Rose sat as far from him as the firelight would allow, hugging her knees. She was still wearing her auction dress, the blue cotton thin and impractical for the dropping temperature. The desert at night was a treacherous thing. It stole the heat from your bones. She shivered, her teeth beginning to chatter. Kai was busy tending to the horse, checking its hooves and rubbing it down with a handful of dry grass. He moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. Every movement had a purpose. When he was finished, he walked to his saddlebags and pulled out a heavy buffalo robe. He walked over to where Rose sat shivering. He didn't say a word. He simply shook out the fur and draped it over her shoulders. As he adjusted the heavy hide, the back of his hand brushed against her bare neck. Rose flinched violently, a gasp escaping her lips. She looked up, eyes wide, expecting him to grab her, to claim the rights the marriage certificate gave him. Kai froze. His hand hovered in the air for a second. Then he slowly pulled it back. His dark eyes locked with hers. There was no aggression in them. There was a question, and perhaps a flicker of hurt. "I am not Colton Briggs," he said softly. "I do not take what is not given." Rose felt the blood rush to her face. The warmth of the buffalo robe was enveloping her, smelling of earth and musk. But the warmth of his accidental touch lingered on her skin like a brand. She stammered, looking down at the fire. "I am sorry, I just—" "Sleep," Kai said, turning away. "We ride at first light." He moved to the other side of the fire, laying out a simple bedroll. He lay down with his back to her, his revolver within easy reach of his hand. Rose pulled the robe tighter around herself, burying her nose in the fur. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched the rise and fall of his breathing. He was a stranger, an enemy of her people, and yet, for the first time in years, she felt a strange, terrifying safety. She lay down, watching the sparks drift up toward the stars. The sky was vast, indifferent, and beautiful. It was the same sky that hung over Rimstone, but here, without the roofs and the noise, it felt heavy with judgment. "If I run," she thought, "I would die. If I stay, what do I become?" The morning brought no answers, only a sky the color of bruised iron. The wind had picked up, carrying the taste of grit. "The weather is turning," Kai said as he kicked dirt over the embers of their fire. "We need to move." They rode north, toward the jagged spine of the mountains. The terrain grew rougher, the sagebrush giving way to twisted juniper and sharp rocks. "Where are we going?" Rose asked, shouting over the rising wind. She was riding behind him again, her arms wrapped around his waist. The awkwardness of the previous day had faded into necessity. She held on because she had to. "My people's winter camp is too far," Kai called back. "And the soldiers patrol the southern passes. We go to the deep narrows, but first, we must cross the flatlands." "Why did you really come to Rimstone?" Rose asked, pressing her face against his back to shield herself from the stinging sand. "It was not just for me. You were there for days before the auction." Kai was silent for a long moment. "The Iron Snake," he said finally. "The railroad." "Mr. Mortimer brings it," Rose said. "He says it brings prosperity." "It brings fences," Kai said, his voice hard. "It cuts the land. It stops the buffalo. The herds cannot migrate. Without the buffalo, the people starve. Mortimer and his kind. They draw lines on paper and call it law, but the land does not know these lines." Rose thought of the map she'd seen in her father's inn once, the straight black line of the proposed track slicing through the territory. She had thought it looked like progress. Now, feeling the heartbeat of the man who lived on that land, she saw it differently. It was a scar, a wound. Rose started, but the wind snatched her words away. Suddenly, the sky turned a sickly yellow. The horizon disappeared, swallowed by a wall of churning dust that stretched from the earth to the heavens. "Hold on!" Kai shouted. He spurred the horse, driving it toward a cluster of sandstone formations rising from the desert floor like broken teeth. The sandstorm hit them with the force of a physical blow. It was blinding, choking, the world reduced to a swirling vortex of beige violence. Rose buried her face in Kai's vest, eyes squeezed shut, unable to breathe. Kai guided the horse into a narrow fissure in the rock. A shallow cave barely deep enough for the animal and 2 people. He slid off and pulled Rose down. "Get back!" he yelled over the roar of the wind. He forced the horse to kneel, using its body as a shield against the mouth of the cave, then pulled Rose deeper into the crevice. It was tight. The space was so small they were forced together, chest to chest, legs tangled. Kai pulled the buffalo robe over both of them, creating a small, dark cocoon against the storm. Rose was gasping, coughing up dust. Kai's arm was around her, holding her steady. In the darkness of the robe, the rest of the world vanished. There was only the roar of the wind outside and the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart against her cheek. She could feel the heat radiating from him. It was intense, overwhelming. She was pressed along the length of his body, every curve of her soft form meeting the hard planes of his muscle. The smell of him, leather, sweat, and rain filled her senses. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was a rumble in his chest, vibrating against her. "No," she whispered. "Just scared." His hand moved, brushing the hair from her face. It was a gentle, almost reverent touch. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, lingering near her ear. It was an intimate gesture, far more intimate than the situation demanded. Rose looked up. In the dim light filtering through the heavy hide, she saw his eyes watching her. The barrier between them, the racial divide. The buyer and the bought seemed too thin, worn down by the abrasive sand outside. Her breath hitched. She should pull away. She should be terrified. But her body betrayed her. She leaned into his touch, just a fraction of an inch. A longing, sharp and sudden, pierced through her fear. It was a desire to be held, not as a possession, but as a woman. Kai's thumb brushed her lower lip. His gaze dropped to her mouth, dark and intense. The air in the small cave grew heavy, charged with a static that made Rose's skin prickle. Then, he pulled his hand away. He shifted, creating a sliver of space between them, though there was nowhere to go. "The storm will pass," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Wait." He did not touch her again, but the memory of his hand on her face burned in the darkness for hours until the wind finally died down. Morning broke with a deceptive calm. The air was clear, scrubbed clean by the sand. They emerged from the cave, shaking the dust from their clothes. Kai was checking the horse's nostrils for sand when the crack echoed off the canyon walls. Ping! A spray of rock chips exploded from the boulder inches from Rose's head. She froze, her mind failing to register the sound. "Down!" Kai roared. He didn't wait for her to react. He launched himself at her, tackling her to the ground behind the cover of the fallen rocks. His body covered hers completely, a heavy, protective weight. A second shot whined overhead, ricocheting off the stone. "They are tracking us," Kai hissed into her ear. "A sharpshooter, long range." Rose was trembling, her face pressed into the dirt. "Is it Briggs?" "Maybe, or a hired gun." Kai lifted his head slightly, scanning the ridgeline 1/2 mile away. "Stay down. Do not move." He rolled off her, moving into a crouch, drawing the long rifle from the scabbard on his saddle. He didn't look like the gentleman who had shared his blanket the night before. He looked lethal. "We cannot go to the mountains," he said. His eyes narrowed. "They expect that they are waiting." "Then where?" Rose asked, spitting dirt from her mouth. "Drybone," Kai said. "The Trader's Canyon. It is neutral ground. Even Briggs will not start a war there." He looked back at her. "We have to run. When I say go, you run for the horse. Do not look back. Do you understand?" Rose nodded, gripping her skirts. She looked at the man who had bought her, the man who had just used his own body to shield her from a bullet. "Go!" Kai shouted. They scrambled for the horse, the fear of the bullet lending wings to their feet. As they galloped away, weaving through the rocks to spoil the shooter's aim, Rose wrapped her arms around Kai's waist, burying her face in his back. This time, she didn't hold on just to keep from falling. She held on because he was the only solid thing in a world that wanted her dead. They rode hard for the southeast, away from the logical path, toward the lawless refuge of Drybone, where thieves and kings sat at the same table, and in the dust behind them, the unseen hunter packed up his rifle and began the slow, patient pursuit. Drybone Canyon was not on any official government map, and that was precisely why it existed. It was a jagged tear in the earth where the high desert fractured into a maze of sandstone and shadow. Here, the law of the United States Army held no sway, and the treaties of the Comanche were suspended in favor of the older, simpler law of coin and barter. As Kai guided their horses down the steep, winding trail, Rose smelled the camp before she saw it. It was a pungent mixture of roasting goat meat, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the sharp tang of horse liniment. Tents made of canvas and buffalo hide clustered around a muddy watering hole. Men of every description, Mexican vaqueros, American deserters, renegade Apaches, and traders with no allegiance but to profit moved through the haze. They dismounted near a corral made of twisted mesquite branches. A man with a thick black mustache and a hat adorned with silver conchos approached them, his smile revealing a gold tooth that glinted in the harsh sunlight. "Kai no Koni," the man said, spreading his arms wide. "I heard the wind whisper your name, but I did not think you would be foolish enough to ride a painted horse this close to the soldiers." "Miguel." Kai nodded, dismounting but keeping the reins of Rose's horse in his hand. "The wind talks too much. I need water and fresh grain." Miguel Reyes, the finest horse trader in the territory, turned his dark eyes toward Rose. His gaze was appraising but respectful, lacking the leering hunger she had grown accustomed to in Rimstone. "And for the señorita, perhaps a ticket back to civilization." "She stays with me," Kai said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Miguel raised an eyebrow, but whistled to a stable boy to take the horses. He led them toward a large fire where a pot of beans was bubbling. "Come, eat. The news travels fast here. Kai, they say a Comanche bought a white bride in Rimstone. They say Judge Mortimer is very unhappy." They sat on log stumps. Rose kept her head down, but her eyes were darting everywhere. Near the fire, a man in a tattered blue uniform, a deserter from the cavalry, by the look of his rot-gut whiskey bottle, was loudly recounting a story to anyone who would listen. "Surveyors are pushing west next week," the soldier slurred, waving a crumpled piece of parchment. "Big money. The judge. He has got it all worked out. Clean sweep. No more savages. No more squatters." Rose stiffened. She looked at the paper flapping in the soldier's hand. It was a map, marked with red ink. "Kai," she whispered, nudging his arm. Kai followed her gaze. He stood up, walked over to the drunkard, and dropped a silver coin onto the crate the man was using as a table. "For the whiskey," Kai said. "And for a look at that paper." The soldier, bleary-eyed, snatched the coin and laughed. "Look all you want, Chief. Unless you can read an engineering script, it is just lines." Kai brought the map back to Rose. She spread it out on her knees, her fingers tracing the faded ink. Her father had taught her how to keep the ledger at the inn, but he had also taught her how to read the land deeds that the bankers used to steal farms. "This is not just a survey," Rose murmured, her brow furrowing. "Look here, these coordinates, they run right through the main watering holes of your winter hunting grounds. And here," she pointed to a column of figures scribbled in the margin. "These are not distances. These are share percentages." "Shares?" Kai asked, leaning closer. The smell of him dust and leather enveloped her. "Stocks," Rose explained, her voice rising with realization. "Silas Mortimer is not just clearing the land for the government. He is being paid in railroad stock for every mile of track laid without incident. If he drives your people out, his shares triple in value. He is starting a war to make himself rich." Kai's face hardened into a mask of stone. "He sells blood for paper. He is selling your future," Rose said, looking up at him. "And mine. This proves he's manipulating the army reports to justify the eviction." Before Kai could respond, a hush fell over the camp. The ambient noise of bartering and gambling died away, replaced by the ominous click of hammers being pulled back on revolvers. Rose turned. Standing at the entrance of the canyon, flanked by 4 dusty cowboys, was Colton Briggs. The rancher looked tired, his face sunburned and streaked with grime, but his eyes were bright with malice. He spotted them immediately. "Well now," Colton called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I heard a rumor that you rats might scurry to the nearest hole." Miguel Reyes stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his knife. "This is neutral ground. Mr. Briggs, we do not want trouble." "I have no quarrel with you, Miguel," Colton said, walking forward, his spurs jingling. He stopped 10 paces from where Kai and Rose stood. "I am just here to correct a mistake." He looked at Rose, ignoring Kai completely. "Get your things. Rose, I am prepared to offer double what the savage paid, $200. You are coming home." Rose stood up, her legs shaking but her voice steady. "I am not a heifer you can brand because you lost the first auction. Colton, I am not going anywhere with you." Colton's face darkened. "You think you have a choice. Look at him. He is a dead man walking. You want to die in the dirt with him? I would rather die in the dirt than live in your house." Rose spat. Colton snarled and went for his gun. It happened in the space of a heartbeat. Kai did not draw from the hip like a gunslinger in a dime novel. His movement was fluid, efficient. The heavy Colt appeared in his hand, and he fired before Colton's weapon had cleared leather. Bang! The shot was deafening in the enclosed canyon. Colton Briggs yelled and dropped his gun. Clutching his hand, he was not hit, but the bullet had struck the metal trigger guard of his revolver, sending a shockwave through his arm and knocking the weapon into the dust. The 4 cowboys behind Colton drew their weapons, but they froze. Every man in the camp, Miguel included, now had a gun trained on the intruders. Kai stood with his smoking pistol leveled at Colton's chest. He could have killed him. It would have been easy. The shot to the heart was there. "Pick up your gun," Kai said, his voice cold and flat, "and ride out. If you return, I will not miss it." Colton stared at him, cradling his numb hand. Humiliated in front of the entire camp, he spat on the ground, glared at Rose with pure hatred, and signaled his men to retreat. "This is not over. Comanche, the army will hear about this." As they rode away, the tension in the camp slowly dissipated, though the wary glances remained. Rose turned on Kai, her chest heaving. "Why?" she demanded, her voice trembling with adrenaline and anger. "He will come back. You know he will come back. You should have killed him." Kai holstered his weapon, his expression unreadable. "If I kill a white rancher in front of witnesses, the narrative changes. It became a Comanche massacre. The army will not just hunt me, they will burn my village. They will kill women and children to punish the savage murderer." He looked down at her, and, for the first time, Rose saw the immense weight pressing down on his shoulders. He was not just a man fighting for a woman. He was a man walking a tightrope over a canyon of genocide. "I cannot be just a man." "Rose," he said softly, "I represent the excuse they are looking for. I must be better than they are, or my people die." Rose felt her anger drain away, replaced by a profound shame. She had only thought of her own safety. He was thinking of a nation. I understand," she whispered. That night, they camped on a ridge overlooking the canyon, away from the prying eyes of the traders. The wind had died down, leaving a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Rose sat by the small fire, trying to work a comb through her tangled red hair. The sandstorm had turned it into a knotted mess. She tugged at a particularly stubborn snarl, wincing as tears pricked her eyes. Her frustration was about the hair, but it was also about everything else. The fear, the violence, the exhaustion. "Let me," a voice said. Rose froze. Kai was standing behind her. He did not wait for an answer. He sat down on a rock behind her and held out his hand. "Give it to me." She handed him her cheap, broken comb. He looked at it, shook his head, and reached into his pouch. He pulled out a comb made of polished riverwood, carved with intricate geometric patterns of the Comanche. "This belonged to my sister," Kai said quietly. "She died of the coughing sickness 2 winters ago. She had hair like a raven's wing, but it tangled just as badly. He began to comb Rose's hair. He was incredibly gentle, his large, calloused hands, which she had seen wield a gun with deadly speed only hours before, now moved with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. He worked the knots out patiently, starting from the ends and working his way up. The sound of the wood pulling through her hair was rhythmic, hypnotic. Rose closed her eyes. She could feel the heat of his body behind her, radiating against her back. His knuckles brushed against the sensitive skin of her nape. A shiver ran down her spine, not of fear, but of something else, a sudden, sharp awareness of him as a man. "Your hair is the color of the red earth at sunset," Kai murmured. It was not a compliment paid to court her. It sounded like an observation of the natural world. Rose leaned back slightly, almost unconsciously. "Kai," she breathed. His hand stilled. He was close enough that she could hear the subtle change in his breathing, a slight hitch, a deepening. The air between them crackled. It would be so easy to turn around, to lean into him, to find comfort in the only person who had stood between her and the world. Kai's hand lingered near her neck. His thumb traced the line of her pulse. He wanted to... God, she could feel that he wanted to. Then, he pulled away. The loss of his warmth was sudden and cold. "It is done," he said, his voice rough. He stood up and walked to the edge of the ridge, staring out into the darkness. Rose touched her hair, now smooth and falling over her shoulders. She understood. He was afraid. Not of Colton Briggs, but of this, of the complication of caring for her. She walked over to him. "We cannot stay here. Kai, the map, the shares. We need proof." Kai did not look at her. Proof does not matter to men like Mortimer. "It matters to the federal marshals," Rose insisted. "My father always said the only thing that scares a crooked businessman is the federal government. If we can get the original contract, the one with his signature and the railroad seal, we can prove he is defrauding the territory." "Where is this contract?" "In his office. Safe," Rose said. "In Rimstone." Kai turned to look at her, incredulous. "You want to go back into the wolf's den?" "It is the only way to stop the railroad from destroying your land," Rose said firmly. "I know the combination. I used to deliver the inn's tax payments. I saw him open it." Kai studied her face in the moonlight. He saw the steel in her gray eyes. She was not the frightened girl on the auction block anymore. "It is madness," he said. "It is justice," she replied. Kai nodded slowly. "We ride at dawn." The journey back toward Rimstone took them through a labyrinth of narrow slot canyons to avoid Briggs's patrols. The sky, which had been clear, suddenly bruised purple in the west. In the desert, rain was a blessing and a curse. "Rain is coming," Kai warned, looking at the clouds bunching against the peaks. "We must hurry. These canyons flood." They pushed the horses, but the storm was faster. It did not start with a sprinkle. The heavens simply opened. Water hammered down, turning the dust to slick mud instantly. Then came the roar, a sound like a freight train, echoing off the stone walls. "Flash flood!" Kai shouted. "Climb now!" They abandoned the horses. Scrambling up the steep sandstone bank, the water hit seconds later a wall of brown sludge, churning with uprooted trees and boulders. It crashed into the canyon floor where they had been standing moments before. Rose slipped on the wet rock. Her boots lost purchase, and she slid backward toward the churning water. "Kai!" He lunged for her, his hand clamping around her wrist like an iron shackle. He didn't just pull. He hauled her up with a grunt of exertion, swinging her body up onto the narrow ledge where he stood. She crashed into him, and they both fell back against the rock wall, gasping for air. The rain was torrential, soaking them to the bone in seconds. Rose was pressed against him, her legs tangled with his. Her wet dress clung to her skin like a second layer, outlining every curve. Kai's buckskins were soaked, heavy and dark. They lay there for a moment, the adrenaline of the near-death experience mixing with the proximity. Rose looked up at him, water streaming down her face. His hair was plastered to his neck. His chest heaved against hers. This was not the gentle tension of the hair combing. This was raw. It was the frantic, desperate energy of survival. Kai looked down at her. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then to the pulse beating frantically at her throat, visible through the wet fabric of her dress. His hands were on her waist, gripping hard, as if to make sure the water didn't take her. "You are foolish," he growled, but there was no heat in the words. "You almost died." "You caught me," Rose whispered. He leaned in. His face was inches from hers. The rain masked the heat of their bodies, but Rose could feel it. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted to taste the rain on his lips. Kai closed his eyes for a second, a look of exquisite torture crossing his face. He pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of intimacy that felt more profound than a kiss. "We survive first," he whispered against her skin. Then we decide." He pulled back, helping her sit up, putting a respectful distance between them, though his eyes lingered on her. They waited out the flood on that ledge, shivering but alive. When the water receded enough to move, they retrieved their spooked horses and made the final push to the outskirts of Rimstone. They set up a dry camp in a dense thicket of mesquite overlooking the town. The lights of Rimstone twinkled below, deceptive and inviting. "Tomorrow night," Kai said, sharpening his knife by the firelight. "We go in." He called Rose over. "Give me your hand." She extended her palm. Kai took a piece of charcoal from the fire and began to draw on her skin. "This is the layout of the back alleys," he said. His voice businesslike, but his touch gentle. "If we get separated, you go here, to the old mission." He then pulled a small, wicked-looking knife from his boot. "And this," he said, handing it to her. "It goes in your corset. If Silas or Briggs touches you—" "I know," Rose said, gripping the handle. She looked at the town that had sold her, and then at the warrior who had bought her freedom. "I aim for the throat." Kai looked at her with fierce approval. "No, you aim for the heart. It stops them faster." They sat in the darkness, the weapons of war between them, plotting to steal a future from the men who thought they owned the world. The rising action was over. The climax was waiting in the shadows of the town below. Rimstone slept with one eye open, bathed in the silver light of a hanging moon. The streets were empty of honest men, leaving only the shadows of the saloons and the flickering gas lamps to keep company with the devil. Rose Calder adjusted the shawl around her shoulders, pulling it tight to hide the tremors in her hands. She stood before the heavy oak door of the land office, the domain of Judge Silas Mortimer. She had rubbed dust onto her cheeks and allowed her hair to fall in disarray, crafting the image of a woman broken by the harsh reality of the desert. High above, flattened against the parapet of the roof, Kai no Koni watched. He was a silhouette cut from the night sky, his breathing slow and rhythmic. He signaled once a soft scratch against the wood siding that sounded like a settling beam. Rose took a breath that tasted of fear and resolve. She knocked. The door swung open a moment later. Silas Mortimer stood there in his shirt sleeves, a glass of brandy in one hand and a look of irritated surprise on his face. When he saw Rose, the irritation smoothed into a smug, predatory satisfaction. "Well, well," Silas purred. Stepping back to allow her entry, "The prodigal bride returns. I told the sheriff you would not last 2 days out there with a savage. Did he beat you, or did you simply realize that a roof and a soft bed are worth more than pride?" Rose stepped inside, letting her shoulders slump. The office smelled of expensive tobacco and old paper. He is an animal," she lied, her voice trembling. "He took me to the canyons. There was no food. I waited until he slept. And I took a horse. I just want to go home." "Judge, please." Silas chuckled, a dry sound like dead leaves skittering on stone. He closed the door and locked it. "Home. You have no home. Rose, your father has drunk away the last of his credit. You belong to the Comanche now. Unless, of course, the contract were to be renegotiated." Rose looked up at him through her lashes, feigning desperation. "I will do anything. I found this in his saddlebags." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pouch of gold dust, Kai's money. It is nearly $50. It is a down payment. If you annul the marriage, I will work off the rest. I will scrub floors. Anything." Silas looked at the gold. Greed, as always, was his compass. $50, he mused. Hardly covers the inconvenience, but it is a start. He walked behind his heavy mahogany desk. "I suppose I could open the ledger, see exactly what the damages are." He turned to the large iron safe in the corner. Rose held her breath. This was the moment. She watched his hands as he spun the dial. Right 3 turns, left 2, right 1. The heavy click of the tumblers falling into place echoed in the silent room. As the heavy door swung open, Rose moved. She did not move like a servant. She moved like a woman who had spent the last 3 days riding with a warrior. "Oh, thank you, Judge," she gushed, closing the distance. She pretended to stumble, knocking into a stack of books on his desk. "Clumsy girl," Silas snapped, turning his head. In that split second of distraction, Rose reached into the open safe. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of a revolver, but she bypassed it, grabbing the thick leather folio stamped with the seal of the Union Pacific Railroad. She shoved it into the bodice of her dress, the parchment crinkling against her skin. Silas turned back, his eyes narrowing. He saw her hand retreating from the safe. He saw the shift in her stance, the way her feet were planted, ready to run. "You little thief!" Silas hissed. The veneer of the gentleman vanished. He lunged across the desk, grabbing her wrist. "Now!" Rose screamed. The skylight above them shattered in a rain of glass. Kai dropped into the room like a hawk striking its prey. He landed in a crouch, the glass crunching under his boots, his knife already in his hand. Silas recoiled, releasing Rose to fumble for the drawer where he kept his own pistol. "Run, Rose!" Kai shouted, flipping the heavy desk over with a heave of his shoulder to block Silas. Rose scrambled for the door, unlocking it with fumbling fingers. She burst out into the street, her lungs burning. Kai was right behind her, vaulting over the overturned desk as a gunshot blew a hole in the wood paneling near his head. "Sheriff Briggs," Silas roared from inside the office. "Stop them!" The shadows of the street suddenly sprouted teeth. From the alleyway next to the saloon, Colton Briggs emerged, flanked by 2 hired guns. He had been waiting. It was a trap within a trap. "I told you I do not like to lose." Colton grinned, raising his revolver. Kai did not slow down. He grabbed Rose's arm and yanked her sideways into the narrow gap between the land office and the bank, just as bullets chewed up the dirt where they had been standing. "The train!" Kai gritted out, pointing toward the end of the street. A steam whistle shrieked in the distance. The midnight supply train, a behemoth of iron and fire, was chugging out of the depot, gathering speed. "It is moving." Rose cried, hitching up her skirts to run. "Then we run faster," Kai said. They sprinted down the back alleys, jumping over crates and dodging clotheslines. Behind them, they heard the heavy boots of their pursuers and the shouting of men. They burst out onto the train tracks just as the locomotive hissed past, a dragon breathing smoke and ash. The cars were clattering by flatbeds loaded with timber, boxcars sealed tight. "Jump!" Kai yelled. He grabbed the iron ladder of a passing boxcar and swung himself up. He extended his hand. Rose ran alongside the moving metal beast, her legs pumping, the gravel sliding under her boots. She reached out. Kai's fingers closed around her wrist, a grip of steel. He hauled her up, her feet dangling for a terrifying second before she found purchase on the ladder. A bullet sparked off the metal rung next to her hand. Colton Briggs and his men were galloping alongside the train on horseback, firing as they rode. Colton spurred his horse, bringing it alongside a flatbed car 3 cars back. He stood in his stirrups and leaped, landing on the wooden planks with a roll. His men followed. "To the roof," Kai commanded. "We cannot get trapped inside." They scrambled up the ladder to the top of the boxcar. The wind hit them instantly, a physical force carrying the sting of coal dust. The train was picking up speed, rocking violently as it navigated the curves leading out of town. Rose dropped to her hands and knees, clutching the central walkway to keep from being blown off. The world was a blur of darkness rushing by. "Stay low," Kai shouted, drawing his revolver. Colton Briggs appeared at the edge of the car behind them. He walked with the rolling gait of a man born in the saddle, balancing easily on the shifting roof. "Nowhere left to run. Savage!" Colton yelled over the roar of the engine. He fired. Kai rolled to the left, the bullet punching a hole in the roof where he had been. He fired back, the muzzle flash illuminating the night. Colton ducked behind a ventilation hatch. "Get to the engine," Kai told Rose. "The soldiers guard the gold shipment in the front car." "I am not leaving you," Rose shouted back. "Go!" Kai roared, a sound that rivaled the locomotive. Rose scrambled forward, jumping the gap between the boxcars. It was a terrifying leap over the coupling, the tracks flashing by underneath like grinding teeth. She landed hard, scraping her palms, and kept moving. One of Colton's hired guns, a man with a scar across his nose, had climbed up the ladder ahead of her to cut her off. He stood blocking her path, a knife glinting in his hand. "Pretty little thing," the man sneered. "Give me the papers, and maybe I will let you live." Rose backed away. She reached into her corset, her fingers closing around the handle of the knife Kai had given her. "Aim for the heart," he had said. But the man was big, and his reach was long. The train lurched as it hit a switch. The gunman stumbled. Rose did not hesitate. She did not aim for the heart. She dropped to the deck and kicked out with both legs, driving her heels into the man's kneecap. He howled, his leg buckling. As he fell, Rose scrambled forward, slashing wildly with her knife. The blade caught his forearm, and he dropped his weapon. Desperate, he lunged for her. Grabbing her ankle, Rose kicked him in the face with her other boot. Hard. He lost his grip. Sliding backward on the slick roof, he clawed at the wood, but momentum was against him. With a scream that was swallowed by the wind, he tumbled off the side of the train into the darkness. Rose gasped for air, scrambling to her feet. She looked back. Kai and Colton were locked in hand-to-hand combat on the roof of the rear car. Colton had knocked the gun from Kai's hand, and now they were wrestling. Two shadows outlined against the sparks from the smokestack. Colton was stronger, heavier. He drove a fist into Kai's ribs, then another to his jaw. Kai staggered back, perilously close to the edge. "You should have stayed in the dirt," Colton screamed, lunging. Kai used the rancher's momentum against him. He dropped to one knee, seizing Colton's arm and twisting. He used a judo throw he had never learned in a dojo but had perfected in the dust of the plains. Colton flew over Kai's shoulder. Slamming onto the wooden roof, Kai was on him instantly, his forearm pressing against Colton's throat. "I am not in the dirt," Kai snarled, his face inches from the rancher's. "I am the one standing." He struck Colton once, a precise blow to the temple. The rancher went limp. Kai did not kill him. He used the leather thong from his hair to bind Colton's hands to the metal grating of the walkway. But the victory was short-lived. "Kai!" Rose's scream tore through the air. Kai spun around. Silas Mortimer had climbed up from the caboose. He stood in the car behind Rose. He had one arm wrapped around Rose's neck, pulling her back against his chest. In his other hand, he held a Derringer pistol pressed against her temple. "Enough!" Silas shrieked. His suit was ruined, his face a mask of panicked rage. "Throw the papers away, or I paint this train with her brains." Kai froze. He stood 2 cars away, helpless. The wind whipped his hair around his face. He looked at Rose. She was terrified, her eyes wide and white in the moonlight. But she was not crying. "Do it!" Silas yelled. "The contract, toss it." Kai reached into his vest. He didn't have the papers Rose did, but Silas didn't know that. He held up his empty hand slowly. "Let her go," Kai said, his voice carrying over the wind. "You want the land, you want the money, you can have it, just let her go." "I want it all," Silas spat. "I want the land, the money, and you dead. You ruined everything." Kai looked at Rose. At that moment, time seemed to suspend. He saw the woman he had bought to save a debt, the woman he had learned to respect, the woman he had begun to love. And he saw the choice. If he attacked, she died. If he surrendered, the evidence was lost, and his people were doomed. He took a step back, lowering his hands. He was choosing her. He was sacrificing a nation for one life. Rose saw it in his eyes. She saw the surrender, and a fire ignited in her chest. She had spent her life being bartered, sold, and protected. She was done. She was not a damsel. She was a survivor of Rimstone. "No," Rose whispered. "What?" Silas growled, tightening his grip. "I said no." Rose threw her head back, smashing it into Silas's nose. Bone crunched. As he reeled back in pain, she sank her teeth into the fleshy part of his hand holding the gun. She bit down until she tasted copper. Silas screamed, his reflex causing his hand to jerk. The gun went off. Bang. The bullet missed Rose's head by an inch. It smashed into the red glass of the signal lantern hanging from the brake wheel just a few feet away. The engineer in the locomotive ahead saw the signal light shatter and vanish. Fearing a track obstruction or a separation, he slammed on the emergency brakes. The screech of metal on metal was ear-splitting. Sparks showered the train like fireworks. The deceleration was violent. Rose was thrown forward, grabbing onto the brake wheel. Kai dropped flat, digging his fingers into the roof slats. Silas Mortimer was not so lucky. He was thrown backward by the force of the stop. He slid off the roof of the car, his fingernails scratching uselessly against the wood. He vanished over the side. The train skidded to a halt, the cars banging together with thunderous crashes. Silence returned to the desert, heavy and ringing. Kai scrambled up and ran across the cars, leaping the gaps until he reached Rose. "Rose!" He grabbed her shoulders, checking her for blood. "Are you hit?" "I am fine," she gasped, trembling violently. "Silas! He fell!" They moved to the edge of the car and looked down. Silas Mortimer was not dead. He was dangling precariously. The tail of his long frock coat snagged on a protruding metal bolt of the coupling between the cars. His feet kicked uselessly at the empty air, inches above the crushing wheels and the track. Below him was a steep embankment dropping into a rocky ravine. "Help me," Silas wailed, his face pale as death. "Pull me up, I will pay you, I will give you anything." Kai stared down at the man who had orchestrated the starvation of his people, the man who had treated Rose like cattle. It would be so easy. A nudge of his boot, or simply doing nothing. The coat would rip eventually. Kai looked at Rose. She was watching him, waiting. "He deserves to fall," Rose said, her voice hard. "Yes," Kai said. "He does." He remembered the anger of the young warriors in his tribe. He remembered the white child dying. He remembered the hate in Colton Briggs's eyes. If he let Silas die, he became just another executioner in a land of blood. "But I am not him," Kai said. He reached down. He grabbed Silas by the collar of his coat and hauled him up with a grunt of effort. He threw the judge onto the roof of the train, face down. Silas gasped for air, sobbing. "Thank you, thank you." Kai put a boot on Silas's neck, pressing his face into the soot. "Save your thanks. You are going to need them for the hangman." He pulled a length of rope from his belt and tied Silas's hands behind his back, tighter than necessary. "Soldiers," Rose pointed. From the front of the train, a squad of Union soldiers, alerted by the gunfire and the emergency stop, came running along the track, rifles at the ready. A lieutenant with a thick beard led them, holding a lantern high. "Hands in the air," the lieutenant shouted. "Identify yourselves." Kai stood up slowly. Raising his hands, he helped Rose to her feet. "I am Kai Nakoni," he announced, his voice steady. "And this is Rose Calder. We have a prisoner, and we have papers you need to see." Rose reached into her bodice and pulled out the crumpled folio. She held it up in the lantern light. "This proves Judge Mortimer is defrauding the United States government and inciting war for profit." The lieutenant looked from the battered judge to the Comanche warrior to the red-haired woman with a bloody knife in her belt. He lowered his rifle slowly. "Well," the soldier said, spitting tobacco, "that is a hell of an accusation, ma'am. You better come down here and explain it." The sun was rising by the time the train reached Fort Stanton, the next military outpost. The ride had been spent in the guard car, Rose and Kai sitting on crates while the lieutenant reviewed the documents. Silas Mortimer and Colton Briggs sat in irons in the corner, silent and sullen. The station platform was bustling with activity. The lieutenant handed the documents to a federal marshal who had been waiting for the supply train. "It is all there, Marshal," the lieutenant said. "Signatures, illegal land deeds, bribery logs." The marshal, a grim man with a gray mustache, looked at Silas. "Judge Mortimer, I have had my eye on your accounts for 6 months. Looks like your luck just ran out." As the soldiers dragged Silas and Colton away toward the stockade, Rose stood on the platform, feeling the morning sun on her face. It felt different today. It didn't burn. It warmed. She turned to Kai. He was standing near his horse, which the soldiers had retrieved from the stock car. He was checking the cinch, avoiding her eyes. He had a bandage on his arm where a bullet had grazed him, and his face was bruised from the fight with Colton. He looked ready to ride. "You are leaving," Rose said. It wasn't a question. Kai stopped his work. He rested his hand on the saddle horn. "The debt is paid. Rose, Elias Calder's name is clear. The papers are with the law. My work is done. Your work." Rose stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, harder than it had during the gunfight. "Is that all this was work?" Kai looked at her then. His eyes were dark pools of conflict. "You know it was not. But look at you, Rose. You are a hero now. The woman who saved the territory. You can go anywhere. You can marry a shopkeeper or a lawyer. You can have a soft life." "A soft life," Rose repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I just fought a man on the roof of a moving train. Kai, I do not think I'm cut out for a soft life anymore." "I am a Comanche," Kai said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "My life is war. It is moving from camp to camp. It is hunger. It is being hated by everyone who looks at you." "I hated Rimstone," Rose said, taking another step. She was close enough to touch him now. "I was sold in Rimstone. You are the only one who ever saw me." "It is dangerous," Kai insisted, though his resolve was cracking. "I have a knife in my corset and a scar on my hand," Rose said, reaching out to take his hand, the hand that had pulled her from the flood, the hand that had combed her hair. "I am not afraid of danger, Kai no Koni. I am afraid of going back to being invisible." She squeezed his fingers. "You bought me for $100, she whispered. "You do not get to return the merchandise just because you are afraid of keeping it." Kai stared at her for a long moment. The mask of the warrior slipped, revealing the man beneath a man who was tired of being alone. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. "I am not afraid," he lied. "Good," Rose said, her voice shaking with relief. "Then stop trying to say goodbye." The steam whistle blew, signaling the train's departure, but neither of them looked at it. They stood on the platform, two outcasts in a world that didn't know what to do with them, holding on to the only thing that made sense. The climax had passed. The storm had broken. Now, they just had to figure out how to live in the quiet that followed. The arrest of Judge Silas Mortimer struck Rimstone like a hammer blow to a pane of glass. The cracks spread instantly, shattering the illusion of order that had held the town in a chokehold for a decade. For 3 days. The dusty streets buzzed not with the usual drunken revelry of cowboys, but with the hushed, frantic whispers of a populace waking up from a nightmare. A federal commission arrived by special train car 48 hours after the incident. They were serious men in gray suits who did not drink at the saloon and who looked at the town's ledger books with the cold, dispassionate eyes of accountants. They set up a temporary office in the very room where Rose had stolen the documents. For the first time, the door was open to the public. Rose Calder stood behind the counter of her father's inn, wiping down the scarred wood with a rag that smelled of lemon oil and vinegar. The inn was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a held breath. Her father, Elias, sat in the corner, nursing a cup of coffee. His hands had stopped shaking for the first time in years. The debt was gone. The ledger that had chained him to Silas Mortimer was now evidence in a federal case. He looked at his daughter. not with the shame of the auction day, but with a bewildered awe, as if he had raised a sparrow and it had turned into a hawk. "They say the railroad is halting construction," Elias murmured, his voice raspy. "Just for a few weeks, to review the surveys." "It will not stop forever, Papa," Rose said, wringing out the rag. "The iron road always comes, but maybe this time it will not come over our graves." She looked out the window. The town was changing. Mrs. Gable, the washerwoman, had filed a formal complaint against the exorbitant water tax Silas had levied. The miners were talking about forming a guild. Fear had evaporated, replaced by a chaotic, messy hope. But Rose felt a hollow ache in her chest that no amount of justice could fill. Kai was gone. He had ridden out the moment the deposition was signed, heading north toward the jagged spine of the mountains where his people made their winter camp. He had to take the news to the council. He had to prove that the war Silas wanted could be stopped. Rose touched the spot on her corset where the knife still rested. She was a hero to the town now. Men tipped their hats when she walked by. The same women who had sneered at her during the auction now brought her pies and asked about her harrowing abduction, painting her as a victim rather than a savior. They did not understand. She was not harrowing. She was lonely. High in the wind-swept mesas, the air smelled of snow and piñon wood. The Comanche encampment was a sprawling circle of buffalo-hide tipis, smoke curling from their tops to join the gray sky. Kai no Koni sat by the central fire of the council lodge. He had stripped off his white man's vest and boots, wearing only the buckskins and moccasins of his people. But he could feel the eyes of the warriors on him, and they felt heavier than the clothes he had discarded. He had spoken for an hour, laying out the events in Rimstone. He told them of the judge, the map, the false reports sent to the army, and the pause in the railroad construction. "The Iron Horse halts," Kai said, his voice steady. "The Blue Coats are investigating on their own. We have bought time, perhaps a season, perhaps a year." "Time," spat a voice from the shadows. Swift Horse, a warrior of similar age but with a temperament like a wildfire, stepped into the light. He was painted for war, a black stripe across his eyes. "You bring us paper promises. Kai, you bring us the words of the white man. Since when do they keep their word? The Treaty of the Arkansas River, the Treaty of the Medicine Lodge. All broken." "This is different," Kai said calmly. "This was not a treaty. This was their own law eating one of their own. I used their rules against them." "You used their rules," Swift Horse sneered, pacing around the fire. "Or did you just become one of them? We heard about the woman, the red-haired one. They say you bought her. They say you fought for her." A murmur went through the council. To buy a captive was one thing. To fight a white chief for her was another. "I fought for the land," Kai said, his eyes hard. "She was the key to the lock. Without her, I would have had no proof." "Or perhaps your heart has turned soft," Swift Horse challenged, stopping directly in front of Kai. "Perhaps you have forgotten the blood of your brother. Perhaps you prefer the scent of white women to the scent of the warpath." Kai stood up. He did not shout. He did not draw his knife. He simply radiated a cold, dangerous stillness that made Swift Horse take a half-step back. "I killed 3 men on the roof of the fire wagon," Kai said, his voice low enough that the elders had to lean in to hear. "I broke the ribs of the cattleman. I hung the judge from the edge of the world. Do not speak to me of softness, Swift Horse, until you have looked into the mouth of the iron snake and pulled its teeth." The tension in the tent was palpable. It was the elder, Gray Cloud, who broke it. He tapped his pipe against his knee, the sound sharp in the silence. "Enough," the old man croaked. "Swift Horse speaks from pain. Kai speaks from sight. The old ways of the bow are good, but the arrow cannot pierce the iron side of the train. We need a mind that understands the enemy." Gray Cloud looked at Kai with milky eyes. "You have bought us time, grandson, but the woman, she is a tether. A warrior cannot fight if his spirit is tied to a ghost in the town." "She is not a ghost," Kai said. "She is the reason we still have a hunting ground." "Then you must decide," Gray Cloud said. You walk 2 paths. Soon, your legs will split. 3 nights later, the rain came to Rimstone. It was a gentle, steady, soaking rain that turned the dust to mud and drummed a rhythmic lullaby on the tin roof of the inn. Rose was in her room in the attic. It was a small, slanted space under the eaves, filled with the smell of dry herbs and old books. A single oil lamp burned on the table, casting long, flickering shadows against the wall. She was trying to mend a tear in a bedsheet, but her hands were idle. She was listening. She was always listening now. A creak. Not the settling of the house, the specific, heavy creak of the 3rd step on the back stairs. Rose did not reach for the knife. She stood up, her heart hammering a rhythm that matched the rain. The door opened silently. Kai stood there. He was dripping wet. His black hair was plastered to his skull, water running down the sharp line of his jaw to drip onto the floorboards. He looked wild, exhausted, and terrifyingly beautiful. You are wet, Rose said. It was a stupid thing to say, but her breath had been stolen. The roof leaks, Kai said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. He stepped inside and closed the door. The space was small, forcing the intimacy of their proximity. He smelled of rain and horse and the night. I heard the marshals are leaving tomorrow, Kai said, moving closer. The inquiry is finished. Yes, Rose breathed. Silas is being transferred to a federal prison in the east. They say he will never see the sun again. And the town, Kai asked. They treat you well. They treat me like a porcelain doll that survived a fire, Rose said, stepping toward him. They want to know if I was scared. They want to know if you hurt me. Kai went still. And what do you tell them? I tell them you saved me, Rose said. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and touched the wet front of his buckskin shirt. I tell them you are the only man in this territory who knows what honor means. Kai let out a ragged breath. He reached up and covered her hand with his own. His skin was cold from the ride, but his palm was burning. I tried to stay away, he confessed, his voice rough. The council, they say I cannot walk 2 paths. They say I must choose. And what did you choose? Rose asked, searching his eyes. Kai did not answer with words. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, brushing away a stray lock of red hair. He looked at her as if memorizing her, as if she were a map of a country he was being exiled from. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the tentative, accidental intimacy of the cave. It was a claim. It was deep, slow, and desperate. His lips were cool from the rain, but his mouth was hot. Rose made a small sound in her throat and rose on her toes, wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, tasting of longing and the metallic tang of the storm. Kai's hands moved from her face to her waist, pulling her flush against him. The damp buckskin rubbed against the thin cotton of her nightdress. She could feel the hard planes of his chest, the beat of his heart thudding against hers. He walked her backward until her legs hit the edge of the narrow bed. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, both of them gasping for air. I cannot be a town man, Rose, he whispered against her skin. I cannot live in a box and count coins. It would kill the part of me that you love. I know, Rose whispered back, her hands tangling in his wet hair. And I cannot be just an innkeeper's daughter anymore. I cannot pour whiskey for men who watched me stand on that auction block and did nothing. I suffocate here. Kai pulled back to look at her. Then where do we go, my people? Some accept you, but many will hate you. You are the face of the enemy to them. You would be isolated. I have been isolated my whole life, Rose said fiercely. I was isolated in a room full of people. She stepped back, creating a sliver of space between them. I do not want to be Comanche, Kai, and I do not want to be white. I want to be us. Is there no place for that? There is no place on the maps, Kai said. Then we make one, Rose said. We make our own map. Kai looked at her, and the conflict in his eyes began to settle into resolve. He reached out and unbuttoned the top button of her dress, pressing a kiss to the hollow of her throat. "Tell me," he murmured against her skin. "The canyon," Rose said, her voice trembling as his hands moved over her. "Where the trade route meets the water. It is neutral ground, neither yours nor mine." Kai kissed the scar on her hand, the one she had hated for so long. "A bridge," he said. "A home," she corrected. The lamp flickered low. Outside, the rain intensified, washing away the dust of rimstone, washing away the past. Inside the small room, there were no more words, only the sound of breathing and the soft rustle of clothes falling away, as two people from warring worlds found a peace that defied every law of the territory. The next morning dawned with a sky of piercing, impossible blue. The storm had scrubbed the world clean. Rose and Kai rode out of Rimstone before the town was fully awake. They did not sneak out this time. They rode down the main street, side by side. Rose sat tall on her mare, her red hair braided back, wearing a riding skirt she had fashioned herself. Kai rode his paint horse, his rifle in its scabbard, looking neither left nor right. They rode past the jail where Silas Mortimer waited for the transport wagon. They rode past the church where they had been forced to sign a paper that was meant to be a shackles, but had become a key. They rode for 3 hours, climbing steadily until they reached a high promontory that overlooked the vast, sweeping valley of the Deep Narrows. Kai reined in his horse and dismounted. He walked to the edge of the cliff. Rose joined him. Below them, the land stretched out like a tawny hide, rippled with the green veins of dry creek beds that were now running with water. To the east, they could see the faint, straight scar of the railroad grading. To the west, a herd of wild mustangs moved like a shadow across the grass, free and unburdened. There, Kai pointed, down in the valley, near the mouth of the Box Canyon, there was a cluster of cottonwood trees and a natural spring. It was the spot where the wagon trail from Santa Fe crossed the old Comanche hunting trace. "It is a day's ride from the town," Kai said, "and a day's ride from the winter camp." "It is perfect," Rose said, the wind whipping her skirt. "We can build a corral there, a stone house. We can trade fresh horses to the travelers. I can sell supplies. I can cook." "I will hunt," Kai said. "I will guide the wagons that respect the land, and I will turn back those that do not." "A way station," Rose nodded. "The last stop before the Badlands." "The first stop," Kai corrected, looking at her. "For us." He took her hand. "But it will be hard. Rose, we will be living on the edge of the knife. The young warriors will test us. The outlaws will test us." "Let them come," Rose said, a smile breaking across her face that made her look 10 years younger. "I have a very large dog to protect me." Kai laughed, a sound that startled a hawk circling above. It was a true laugh, deep and free. "And I have a woman who bites judges," he said. The negotiations took place 2 weeks later, not in a courtroom, but in a tent set up on the very ground they had chosen. The Army lieutenant, a man named Miller who was weary of chasing shadows, sat on a camp stool. Gray Cloud, the Comanche elder, sat on a buffalo robe. Kai and Rose stood between them. "The Army cannot guarantee safety this far out," Lieutenant Miller warned, looking at the map Rose had drawn. "If you build here, you are on your own. If the hostiles attack, we cannot send a column in time. We do not ask for your soldiers," Kai said. "We ask for your paper. Declare this spot a neutral trading post. Mark it on your maps. Tell your supply wagons they can stop here for water and meat." "And in return?" the lieutenant asked. "In return," Kai said, pointing to the red line on the map, "I will ensure that the tribe does not attack the railroad survey parties, provided they stay to the south route. I will be the voice that keeps the peace." The lieutenant looked at Gray Cloud. The old Indian nodded slowly. "The wolf who walks like a man speaks for us. As long as the iron snake stays on the rock and does not eat the buffalo grass, we will hold our arrows." "And you, ma'am," the lieutenant asked Rose, "you are willing to live out here with him?" Rose looked at Kai. She looked at the foundation stones they had already begun to lay. She looked at the vast, open sky that felt like the first deep breath she had taken in her life. "Lieutenant," Rose said, her voice clear and strong, "I was born in a town that sold me for a pocketful of gold. I would rather live in a tent with a man who values me than in a palace with men who count me as cattle. Yes, I am willing." The lieutenant sighed, then pulled a flask from his coat. "Well then, I suppose we have an accord." He poured a splash of whiskey onto the ground, then took a sip. He passed it to Grey Cloud, who took a sip. Then to Kai. Kai took the flask. He did not drink. He handed it to Rose. Rose took a long swallow, the liquid burning her throat in a pleasant way. She handed it back to the soldier. "To the Rimstone way station," the lieutenant said. "To the border." Kai said. The sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the valley. The wind picked up, rustling the cottonwood leaves. It was a lonely place. It was a dangerous place. But as Rose watched Kai hoist a heavy timber onto his shoulder to begin the frame of their roof, she knew it was the only place in the world where she belonged. They were guardians now, not of a town, not of a tribe, but of the fragile, beautiful space between them. The falling action was complete. The war was over. The work of building a life was just beginning. The seasons turned with the slow, grinding certainty of a wagon wheel. The blistering heat of late summer gave way to the golden, melancholic light of autumn, which in turn surrendered to the crisp, biting winds of early winter. 3 months had passed since the train had come to a screeching halt in the desert. The map of the territory had been subtly redrawn, not by surveyors with ink, but by 2 people with stubborn hearts. The Rimstone way station was not a fortress, nor was it a town. It was a scar healed over, situated in the lee of the canyon wall, where the natural spring bubbled up from the red earth. It consisted of a sturdy main cabin built of rough-hewn timber and adobe, a sprawling corral made of twisted mesquite, and a cluster of canvas tents that breathed in the wind. A simple wooden sign swung above the main post, creaking rhythmically. It read, "The Narrows Crossing. Water. Rest. Trade." On a Tuesday morning, the air smelled of wood smoke, roasting venison, and strong coffee. Rose Calder stood on the porch of the main cabin, her hands resting on her hips. She wore a dress of practical gray wool, hemmed shorter than was fashionable in the East to keep it out of the mud, with a leather apron tied around her waist. Her hair, once a wild mane of tangles, was braided back neatly, though a few rebellious red strands still fought for freedom. "More coffee, ma'am." Rose turned to the table set up under the awning. A group of 3 men sat there. One was a fur trapper with a beard like a bird's nest. The second was a Mexican merchant named Diego, who moved silver from Santa Fe. The third was a young Comanche warrior named Red Hawk, who had stopped to water his pony. In Rimstone, these 3 men would have been at each other's throats, or at least segregated by the invisible walls of prejudice. Here, they were just thirsty men sharing a bench. "Coming right up," Rose said. She lifted the heavy iron pot. As she poured the steaming black liquid into Red Hawk's tin cup, her sleeve rode up. The jagged white scar on the back of her hand, the mark of the violence she had survived, caught the sunlight. The trapper stared at it. "Nasty mark there, Mrs. Run in with a cat." Rose didn't pull her hand away. She didn't flush with shame or try to cover it with a glove as she would have done 6 months ago. She looked at the scar, then at the trapper, her gray eyes steady and amused. "No," Rose said, her voice clear. "A run-in with a man who thought he could take what wasn't his. He learned otherwise." Red Hawk grunted into his cup, a sound of approval. The trapper blinked, then nodded respectfully. "Reckon he did." Rose walked back to the kitchen, her spine straight. She was no longer the girl trembling on the auction block, waiting for a man to determine her worth. She was the woman who owned the coffee pot, the land, and her own history. She had bought her freedom not with coin, but with courage. Every person who passed through the crossing knew it. They whispered the story of the Comanche bride. But when they looked at her, they didn't see a victim. They saw the Lady of the Narrows, out by the corral, The dynamic was different but equally transformed. Kai no Koni was breaking a new Mustang, a roar with a temper like a thunderstorm. He moved around the animal not with the brutal force of the white cowboys, who sought to break a horse's spirit, but with a fluid, rhythmic patience. He spoke to the beast in the low, guttural tones of his language, his hand resting on its trembling flank. "Easy, brother," Kai murmured. "Fear is a liar. The rope is just a guide." A commotion at the gate drew his attention. A carriage had pulled in, carrying a nervous-looking banker from St. Louis and his wife, escorted by two dusty outriders. The outriders were arguing with a group of Apache scouts who had come down from the high country to trade deerskins. Hands were hovering near gun belts. Voices were rising. Kai released the horse and vaulted over the corral fence. He didn't run. He walked with a measured, predatory grace that commanded attention. He wore his buckskins, but he had added a heavy canvas duster coat, blending the silhouettes of the two worlds he straddled. "There is no fighting here," Kai said. He didn't shout, but his voice cut through the argument like a knife through canvas. The lead outrider, a man with a scarred nose, sneered. "Tell these savages to get out of the road. Chief, we have paying customers." "The road belongs to no one," Kai said, stepping between the two groups. He looked at the Apache leader, nodding once in respect, then turned his dark eyes on the outrider. "And everyone pays at the crossing. Respect is the currency. If you do not have it, the water trough is closed to you." The banker peered out of the carriage window. He saw the way the Comanche warrior stood relaxed but ready, his hand nowhere near his gun yet entirely lethal. He saw the way the Apache scouts deferred to him, not out of fear, but out of recognition. "Do as he says. Roberts," the banker squeaked. "We don't want trouble." The outrider spat in the dust but stepped back, lowering his hand from his weapon. The tension broke. Kai watched them until the carriage moved to the designated parking area. Then he turned to the Apache leader. "The venison stew is good today. Tall grass," Kai said in the trader's dialect. "Go to the kitchen. My wife will feed you." My wife. The words no longer felt strange on his tongue. They felt like an anchor in a storm. Kai watched the camp settle back into its hum of activity. For years, his hands had only known how to destroy, to notch an arrow, to fire a colt, to set a fire. The guilt of the lives he had taken, specifically the white child he had failed to save years ago, had been a stone in his gut. But here, building this place, keeping the peace not by killing but by standing firm in the middle, he felt the stone beginning to erode. He was not erasing his past, but he was building a future on top of it. That evening, as the sun began to bleed purple into the western sky, the way station grew quiet. The travelers retreated to their tents or the bunkhouse. The wind died down, leaving the cottonwoods to whisper in the twilight. Rose and Kai sat on the bench in front of their cabin. On the small table between them lay a collection of objects that told the story of their journey. There was the wooden comb, carved by Kai, polished smooth by Rose's use every night. Beside it lay a new addition, a delicate handkerchief of white lace, given to Rose by the banker's wife earlier that afternoon as a thank you for a jar of prickly pear jam. And next to that was a bracelet of braided leather and turquoise, a gift from Gray Cloud's wife, welcoming Rose as a daughter of the spirit. Rose traced the pattern on the leather bracelet. "Do you remember the auction?" she asked softly. "It feels like 100 years ago." "I remember," Kai said. He was whittling a piece of cedar, his knife moving with precise strokes. "I remember a woman who looked like she was about to bite the throat out of the auctioneer." Rose laughed, a low, throaty sound that warmed the cooling air. "I was terrified. I thought you were a monster." "I was," Kai said, pausing his work. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "Until you woke me up." He set the wood down and reached into his pocket. "Give me your hand." Rose extended her left hand. The scar was there, but so were the calluses of hard work, the hands of a woman who built things. Kai didn't pull out a gold ring. He didn't have gold, and Rose didn't want it. Gold was what men like Silas Mortimer used to buy people. Instead, Kai produced a simple band. It was made of iron, cut from a discarded railroad spike found near the tracks, polished until it gleamed like gunmetal, and mounted on a strip of soft, cured buckskin. The iron snake tried to eat our land, Kai said quietly. It tried to kill us on that roof, but iron is just metal. It changes depending on whose hand holds the hammer. He slid the band onto her finger. It fit perfectly. I cannot give you a church, Rose, he said, and I cannot give you a tribe. We are the outcasts. But I give you this iron, strong, unbreaking, and I give you my life, every day, until the sun stops rising. Rose looked at the ring, a piece of the railroad that had caused so much pain, now bent into a circle of promise. Tears pricked her eyes, but they didn't fall. I don't need a church, she whispered, and I don't need a tribe. I have the Narrows, and I have you. From the shadows of the cottonwoods, two figures stepped forward. One was Gray Cloud, wrapped in a buffalo robe, his face a map of wrinkles. The other was Sergeant Miller, the old cavalry soldier who had retired and taken a job as their stable master. There was no priest. There was no Bible. Do you stand together? Gray Cloud asked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Against the wind, against the dark. We stand, Kai said. We stand, Rose echoed. Sergeant Miller cleared his throat, looking awkward but solemn. And do you promise to hold this ground to keep the peace between the worlds? So help you God. We do, they said in unison. Gray Cloud nodded once. Then it is done. The sky sees it. The earth feels it. He stepped forward and sprinkled a pinch of sage onto the small fire burning in the brazier. The smoke rose, carrying their silent vows up to the first stars appearing in the indigo sky. It was a wedding of dust and iron, fitting for two people forged in the heat of the frontier. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of peace, but it was a fragile peace. The railroad was still there, miles to the north, a sleeping dragon that would eventually wake. But for now, the treaty was held. Then came the twist that would seal Kai's redemption. It was a week after the ceremony. A dust storm had been blowing since noon, obscuring the road. When the wind finally died, a small figure was left standing at the gate of the corral. He was a boy, perhaps 10 years old. He was skinny, his ribs showing through a tattered, oversized shirt. His skin was the color of coffee with milk, a mestizo, half white, half Mexican, or perhaps half Indian. He had the dark, wary eyes of a coyote pup that had been kicked too many times. Kai was repairing a fence post when he saw him. He froze. For a heartbeat. The years peeled back. Kai saw the burning cabin. He saw the white boy he had failed to save. The look of accusation in the dying eyes. The ghost that had haunted his dreams stood by the gate, waiting. Rose came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the boy, and her maternal instinct, buried under years of survival, flared to life. He is starving, Rose whispered. The boy flinched as Kai approached. He reached for a stick on the ground, holding it like a weapon. Go away, the boy croaked in Spanish. I have no money. I work. I can clean stalls. Kai stopped 5 paces away. He crouched down so he was eye level with the child. He saw the terror, the defiance, the loneliness. I do not want your money, Kai said, speaking in Spanish. And the stalls are clean. The boy lowered the stick slightly. I am Leo. My mother died in Santa Fe. My father, I do not know him. I walked. You walked a long way. Leo, Kai said softly. Kai looked at the boy's feet. His boots were worn through, his toes wrapped in bloody rags. This was the choice. The cycle of the West was usually one of blood for blood. But here, at the crossing, they were writing a new law. We need a man to help with the horses, Kai said, his voice grave. It is hard work. You must learn to ride without a saddle. You must learn to read the tracks. And you must learn to read books. Because my wife says a man who cannot read is blind. Leo's eyes widened. You will hire me. I will not hire you, Kai said. He stood up and extended his hand, the hand that had killed, the hand that had saved, the hand that now wore a wedding band of invisible iron. I will teach you. Leo hesitated. then dropped the stick. He reached out and took Kai's hand. It was a small, dirty hand in a large, scarred one. Rose watched from the porch, a lump in her throat. She saw the shadow lift from Kai's shoulders. The ghost of the dead child vanished, replaced by the living warmth of the boy before him. The debt to the past was finally, truly paid. "Come inside. Leo!" Rose called out, her voice warm. "The stew is hot, and there is bread." The final image of the story came 3 months later. It was the golden hour, that magic time when the harsh western light softens into a lover's caress. The sun was dipping below the rim of the canyon, setting the red rocks on fire. Rose stood on the porch of the cabin, the wind playing with her skirt. She was watching the road. Kai stepped up behind her. He didn't say a word. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. They fit together like 2 jagged pieces of rock that had finally found their seam. In the corral below, young Leo was laughing. He was riding the roan Mustang, the one Kai had broken with gentleness. The boy was clinging to the mane, shouting in a mixture of Spanish and Comanche, his face turned toward the sky in pure, unadulterated joy. Beyond the corral, the road stretched out, winding toward the horizon. Far in the distance, a train whistle blew a lonely, mournful sound. But it was distant. It was just a noise. "He rides well," Rose murmured. "He rides like the wind." Kai agreed, resting his chin on her hair. "He has the spirit." "Are we safe, Kai?" Rose asked, looking at the long shadows stretching across their land. "Will it last?" Kai tightened his hold on her. He looked at the scar on her hand, resting over his own. He looked at the boy. He looked at the home they had built from mud and will. "Nothing lasts forever in the West. Rose," he said softly. "The wind changes, the rain stops. Men forget." He turned her in his arms so he could look into her gray eyes. "But we are not building forever," he said. "We are building today. And today, we are free." Rose smiled, and it was a smile that contained all the sorrow of the auction and all the joy of the redemption. "Yes," she whispered, "we are free." They stood there as the sun vanished, 2 silhouettes against the vast, indifferent, beautiful sky of the American West. The darkness came, but it did not frighten them. Inside the cabin, the fire was lit, and outside, under the stars, they had carved a space where love was the only law that mattered. The story of the last bride and the Comanche warrior was over, but their life was just beginning. Outro. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a long journey from the dust of the auction block to the peace of the canyon, and I hope Rose and Kai's story touched something in your heart. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you listening from today? Are you watching from a busy city or somewhere quiet like the Rimstone Way Station? Please share your thoughts on the ending. Did Kai and Rose make the right choice? If you enjoyed this journey into the American frontier, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button to show your support. And don't forget to press the hype button so this story can be heard by more people around the world. Your support helps me keep these campfires burning. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.